שלום לכולם, אני יעל עיני ואיתי נמצאות מירב שרייבר ושרה פייטון. מירב ואני מאוד מאוד נרגשות להביא לארץ את שרה. שרה היא מומחית בינלאומית בקונסטלציה משפחתית עם שילוב של מדעי המוח, ונפגשנו איתה היום בשביל לדבר על זה, על קונסטלציה משפחתית במדעי המוח, איך הן הולכות ביחד. מירב תראיין את שרה, ואנחנו מאוד מאוד נשמח לראות אתכם בכנס המתקרב של קונסטלציה משפחתית ומדעי המוח שיערך בפברואר. מירב, your turn.
Okay, so you're welcome. We are very delighted to have you with us, Sarah. Me and Yael, we are part of the Constellation Path in Israel that was initiated by Ishai Gaster, and every year we are finding picking the constellation people who really can bring to our field a new vision and combinations of other fields. We would like to hear to know more about the way you make the meeting between neuroscience and constellation work, and also nonviolent communication, which is also a field that you are part of for many years.
Well, I'm very glad to be here. I'm excited about our upcoming training. And before we started recording, we were talking about why had you invited me, and this interest that you have in how constellations are evolving, and what happens when we bring other fields of expertise into constellations and allow constellations to inform what we're working with in the other fields and allow these other fields to inform constellations. What happens? And for me, my particular interest is the world of relational neuroscience and the way in which we're starting to be able to research and understand the way that brains affect other brains. What kind of an effect do we have on each other? It turns out the effect we have on each other is profound. I love to work with different neuroscience researchers, bodies of research, and see how they come alive in our constellation work and inform and make more effective the constellation journey and allow healing, and especially the healing of trauma, to be central to our constellation work. I believe that the healing of trauma, transgenerational trauma, personal trauma, is actually the large intent of the world of constellations. Bert Hellinger talked about the idea that the greater spirit is always moving parts of the self that have been lost back into the integrated whole. And this is very much the philosophy and understanding of Daniel Siegel, who is the person who created interpersonal neurobiology. And what he says is that brains are always reaching for integration. Brains are always trying to heal. And as soon as we create the field in which that is possible, boom, 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 things happen so quickly. People's lives are changed. So what we'll be working with in this workshop is there are 3 different themes we'll be touching on. We'll be touching on shame, we'll be touching on money, and we'll be touching on sexuality, which I'm looking forward to very much. I love these 3 themes, especially together, because all of them are about abundance and scarcity. For example, what we know from neuroscience is that when we have shame, it's because there's a scarcity of accompaniment. We are made to be in company. We are made to be together. And what shame does is it splinters social groups and it pushes people outside. The intention is good. The intention is we're going to push you outside so that you'll modify your behavior and then you'll come back. But mostly what it does in our world is it splinters groups, it pushes people outside, and people stay because there's no accompaniment. They stay in a state of shame, sometimes for decades, sometimes for lifetimes. And sometimes we're carrying that burden of splintering from past generations. And it's even shame will travel within families from generation to generation. So with shame, we're talking about an abundance and a scarcity. And with money, we're talking about abundance and scarcity. And with sexuality, we're talking about the abundance of life energy and the scarcity of life energy. And in all three cases, we'll be looking at what I call unconscious contract work, which is the way in which we, in the effort to avoid trauma, tie ourselves into knots and keep ourselves in places of scarcity rather than the movement into whatever our natural abundance may be.
Thank you. That was very clear, Sarah. And I'm reminded of, traveling in your internet site. It's really a very rich body of work for itself, all the connections you make. I'm curious if you can say something about your biography, what moved you from station to station, yeah.
I first discovered nonviolent communication. Well, first I was traumatized and ashamed and struggling in many ways. And first I discovered nonviolent communication. And because my mom was fractured by trauma, I had, the transgenerational effects of trauma were a huge part of my experience. And this is such an interesting thing about transgenerational trauma. We can have parents and grandparents who were directly traumatized, but what the research shows us is that the children and grandchildren of the traumatized people will carry the trauma even if they haven't lived through the trauma themselves. And this can be immensely confusing, to carry the marks of trauma without having lived through it ourselves. It was lived through in past generations. So I had this intense mark of trauma, not from my own experience, but from my mother's experience, from her past generations' experience. And I also had an adopted son who had lived through terrible trauma. And I couldn't figure out how to hug him. I would go to try to hug him, and I couldn't hug him. And I had discovered nonviolent communication and thought, this is really important. I'm going to learn this. So I went to a nonviolent communication workshop, and they asked me to speak about something important to me, something where I was stuck. So I spoke about my inability to hug my child. And people, instead of telling me what to do or how to be different, they were in a place of trying to deeply understand exactly what was happening for me. And their understanding allowed me to come to a new place. I went home and I could hug my boy. And so because I'm an immensely curious person, I was like, what happened? How did nonviolent communication change me? And I discovered the world of relational neuroscience, the way in which we can have an effect on each other's brains, and the way in which we can heal trauma, and the way in which we are always trying to heal trauma for each other, sometimes in quite ineffective ways, but we're always trying. And then I stumbled across constellation work. And I was placed just by chance as an ancestor in someone's constellation. And I felt this love for my descendant. And I was like, oh my God, what happened there? What's the neuroscience of that? So this is how I came to what I do, was through a lived experience of trauma, a lived experience of healing, and extraordinary experiences, and saying, how do we explain all this? So that's my standpoint and my approach.
Wow. Thank you for sharing this. So it brings me to the next question. How does it look like in the constellation field? Like what does it mean to put the two together?
Well, we're putting all three together. We're putting together an understanding of the kinds of language that stop brains from healing and the kinds of language that support brains to heal. So that's the language component, very much based on nonviolent communication, but also what I call resonant language, an understanding of what kinds of language take brains into fluid spaces as opposed to static spaces. How do we speak in ways that open the world to us, and how do we speak in ways that close the world to us? So when you're working with me, that's one of the aspects that we're holding together. The second is, of course, constellation work itself. My major teacher is Elena Veselago, who studied with Bert Hellinger. So I'm one of the grandchildren rather than the children of Bert. And her work, I believe, is quite beautiful and profound. She has one of the largest institutes in Russia. And I have the joy of speaking Russian. And so I am able to both travel to her to study, and I'm able to translate for her outside of Russia. And so I get some time with her every year. And then the third piece is the neuroscience. How does the neuroscience come into constellations? And we think about when we're working in this way, with the neuroscience informed and trauma informed constellations, we're thinking about how do people's brains work? With the flow of love, we've got the external flow of love from generation to generation. In the brain, we have the internal flow of love. And we know how trauma, personal trauma and transgenerational trauma, disrupts the flow of love both internally and externally. So we begin to look at this, and we're thinking, with everything we know about human brains and how they heal, how can we use the constellations to name what is happening for brains, and to kind of leverage our constellation knowledge and our neuroscience knowledge to kind of brain whisper. We become brain whisperers with constellations when we have an understanding of relational neuroscience. So this is a very embodied way to approach the healing of trauma. It's, for me, constellation work allows us to look with a big lens at our life and the lives of our families. And with these three supports, constellations, relational neuroscience, and trauma, we get to stand and look with such compassion at our own selves and our own journeys and our own families. And compassion and self-compassion are the greatest healing movements in relational neuroscience, as supported by research, and in constellations. Mirav, tell me if I was at all clear.
Yeah.
It's a big question.
I'm already sitting with the next one. You know, knowing that you travel around the world, and you meet today, maybe more in Zoom, you meet many kind of cultures, and now we invite you to the Jewish, Israeli, whatever is here. Maybe there are many more than what I'm saying. It's unique kind of neuroscience.
Yes.
Do you see the difference in working with many nationalities, cultures, religions?
Yes, a huge difference. I don't really know what it is until I get to be in the field of that place. I've gotten to, I do work internationally. So, for example, I've gotten to work with both of you before, even though we've never gotten to meet. I've always wanted to go to Israel, and I feel very honored to be invited and to discover what will it be like to work with the Israeli field.
Yeah, we are curious as well.
Yeah.
Another, one thing that I found also unique that you bring is the way you constellate with the Zoom. Say, can you introduce it?
Yes, of course. As we began the pandemic, I was actually already trying to experiment with doing constellations on Zoom. And what I had discovered, and what has become just richer and richer every time we do it, is that we can use the Zoom whiteboard and we can draw our constellations as they're occurring. So I'll say to a representative, here's the whiteboard, here's the field of the constellation. Where do you go in? What is your shape? Where are you looking? And people will go in as body shaped, but they'll also go in shaped as triangles and rectangles and stars and exploding masses of energy. And during the constellation, they'll transform from shape to shape. It becomes a part of the movement. It's almost like there are a couple of things that happen. One is that the visual allows for the narrative to become very clear and for people to be very engaged. Even if they're just witnessing the constellation, they're still very engaged because the story is visually unfolding on the screen. And the other thing is it becomes very kinesthetic. People's bodies are very involved in their star shape and where they're looking and how they're impacted and affected by the changes that happen in the constellation. So it's another art form on top of constellations.
Yeah, exactly. So you have somebody who is drawing.
Yes. Sometimes I draw and sometimes I have helpers who draw.
Okay. And then they move the shapes on the board.
Yes, it's almost animated. Yeah.
Very unique.
Yeah.
It was really nice to speak to you right now, and really like it feels like already welcoming you before we meet officially in February.
I'm so looking forward to it.
Dates are, we will have Sarah with us on
the 15th, 16th, and 17th of February.
15th, 16th, 17th of February. In Israel, it will be in the afternoon hours. For you, Sarah, it will be morning time. And
the first day is 3 hours and the other 2 are 5 hours each. So we can work in the morning and then go to study or to work on ourselves. Thank you very much, מירב, for the enlightening questions and Sarah for the answers. תודה רבה למירב ולשרה. אנחנו מאוד נשמח לראות אתכם בפברואר. כל הפרטים, הקישור להרשמה נמצאים ככה מתחת לסרטון. אתם מוזמנים להיכנס, לקרוא קצת יותר, וממש נשמח לראות אתכם. אתם לא חייבים להיות עם ידע בקונסטלציה, ואתם יכולים להיות גם עם ידע בקונסטלציה ולהרחיב את האופקים שלכם. הנושא שלנו הוא ריפוי טראומה בעזרת הקונסטלציה ומדעי המוח, אז אם הנושא הזה של עבודה עם טראומה, ריפוי טראומה מעניין אתכם, הסדנאות האלה הן בשבילכם, ממש נשמח לראות אתכם.